want to know what's going on with. Oh, hey, sorry.
Boom. Yeah, what's going on?
Not much.
Well, we hit the hour, so I started the show. I mean, that's the normal thing to do.
You're like trigger finger.
I'm on calling Chris Anderson. Okay, where are you?
I'm in yet another hotel room, but this one is in Potsdam, in Germany.
Oh, okay.
And here for the VE Day trip. And you
Excellent.
look like you're in a hotel room.
I'm in the Thayer Hotel at West Point, sir. And I am scouting a Revolutionary War tour that we don't offer yet, but it's called the Campaigns of George Washington. It goes from here to Philadelphia. So that's what I'm doing this week.
If you're running into Benedict, say hi for him.
I was on a thing called the Treason Trail this morning.
What?
The Treason Trail.
Because you're doing the Washington tour, so that makes sense.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. We're glad to see you here. And today we will be talking about the Pacific War during World War II. So let us know what you're drinking. And we should give a shout out here to all of our top shelf patrons. We have a couple of new ones here.
I know. The columns have moved.
I know. So Tony Coulter is new. And David Maxon is pretty new. We had him on 1 week and then we had him off a week. It was a long story. It was complicated stuff. But it wasn't him, it was us, and now he's back on. So, and if you want to join us as a top shelf patron, look, there's one little place there at the bottom of the second column. We can squeeze you in, and you can do that by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Chris, do we have anybody watching our show today?
I've noticed that there are a few. Ted's joining us from Virginia, Lorelei, Ted Mueller, Kevin McKetty from Providence.
Oh, fantastic.
Rene from Provence, sorry. He's not from Provence. I bet he wish he was.
Skip Esty is here with us again. Richard Cagle. Okay. Hello, Richard and Carolyn. Nice to see you guys. So lots of people here. So I guess we should probably give them an actual show. So instead of just bullshitting for 20 minutes. Yeah. So give me a cue and we'll get going. Do I have the bell? Do I not have the bell?
Well, that would just like push it again. Okay.
All right, forget it.
No, just throw the bell.
Last November, I attended a World War II conference, and author John McManus was there. And I introduced myself, and I said, "Hey, John, I'm Rick Beyer. You were on our show on History Happy Hour." And he was like, "Oh, great. Nice to meet you." And we talked, and he was co-hosting a podcast, and they had me on as a guest, and we laughed about the fact we were doing each other's shows. And then I got back, and I mentioned it to you, and you said...
We've never had John on our show.
Oops. So
John was too nice to mention that to you.
I know, he was so nice. So we're going to fix that. When people think of fighting in the Pacific, they often think of the Navy and the Marines, but it was the Army that did most of the fighting and dying in the war against Japan. And today we're going to dig into that with John McManus, author of Fire and Fortitude, which is volume 1 of a 3-volume series on the U.S. Army in the Pacific War. And John is a military historian, author, and professor of military history at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. He also served as a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He has published 13 books, which puts him ahead of either of us on numerous American military history topics. John, finally, welcome.
Great moments.
See, this was his chance. He could have said, "Oh yeah, I remember those last 2 shows I did, and when we finish the 3 books, then he'll get a hat."
Absolutely. Yeah, chapter and verse. Yeah. Well, regardless of when or not or whatever, it's great to be here now. So thanks for having me.
Well, it's very good to have you here and chatting about this topic. And we're going to try to go through your first book, and then later on in the year do your second and third book. But okay, well, so I'll give. Why don't we remember the Army in the Pacific, and what compelled you to write about it?
Yeah, so I mean, Part of it is that when you dig into the Army's experience in the Pacific Asia War, you're really getting a deep dive. You just have to, because there's no kind of breezy way to get after this. And with the Marines, you can look at a couple of 3 major invasions and have a good sense of what the experience was like in the war for them. And obviously, of course, too, it's a maritime theater on some levels too. We all know that. The Army's war, it takes us to 100 different amphibious invasions. It takes us to involvement in the Continental War too, and the North Burma campaign, and involvement in China. It's extremely complex. And then it also, the Army does, most of the fighting in 2 major campaigns in the Philippines, which in my opinion is the nexus of the American war against Japan. I mean, that is really where the large component of our fighting happens. So, during World War II, about 1.8 million American ground soldiers served in the war against Japan. It's the 3rd largest military force we've ever sent overseas to fight a war. So, I guess what has struck me after all these years is there's no kind of breezy way to get after that, and it takes us into some pretty undesirable corners of our own history. The imperial past, the vulgarity of the war, the racism that's endemic to some extent, really on both sides. But I would argue specifically on the American side too. The Army is dealing with a lot of those awful nuts and bolts of the war against Japan, and so it's and of course too, Douglas MacArthur is kind of the main character for the Army, and he sucks the oxygen out of any room that he's in. And almost by design, he didn't want his soldiers to get a whole lot of credit, unfortunately.
Right. So since we're starting sort of the first session of 3 at least, to set a baseline, what is the state of the Army? It's particularly in terms of the Pacific when this starts, because I think all 3 of us at some point have kind of glibly said, "Oh, we're the 16th largest in the world, and we're really not really prepared," and it kind of gets left at that. But particularly in terms of the Pacific, what does the Army look like, and do they have any idea about what's coming down the pike?
Yeah, at that point, when you're on the cusp of war in 1941. The Army really has 2 major responsibilities in the Pacific. Of course, the Hawaiian Islands, where of course the Pacific Fleet had been redeployed the year before. So the Army has, especially on Oahu, a lot of outposts. It's got anti-aircraft positions that are protecting Pearl Harbor and other installations. It's got Schofield Barracks, which is where the 25th Infantry Division is stationed, and actually the better part of 2 Army divisions on Oahu. The 24th is going to be the other one. They don't call themselves that at this point. They call themselves the Flying Division. And so they're in this kind of train and run up to war. They also obviously have responsibility for the aviation side. We all know the Air Force is part of the Army, but actually my series mainly just covers the ground soldiers. So that just shows you how much the Army had involvement even more. But and then of course the other side is the Philippines, and we are kind of frantically trying to beef up our defenses in the Philippines on the eve of war. And so you have a truly unique military force in the history of this country, almost the kind of British colonial style model in which most of the people in uniform are the locals. The Filipinos comprise about 70 to 75% of the American supposedly military force in the Philippines at that point. So you've got some draftees who are in play, especially on the Hawaiian Islands, not as much in the Philippines. But it's an army that's not prepared for war, but it's feverishly attempting to do so.
And John, maybe we can talk, as we're kind of providing some context for this, talk a little bit about the distances involved. And you sent along this map, which is one of many great maps in your book. But this, I think people, unless you've really looked at it, may fail to realize, just exactly how big a theater this is.
It's enormous. It's a third of the world's surface of ocean, island, continent. It's a vast space, and of course the Hawaiian Islands themselves are actually located closer to Tokyo than they are Washington, and so this is just once the war begins, an incredibly complex kind of undertaking here, because you have to have really good inter-service cooperation, particularly between the Army and the Navy, and of course they're never able to completely agree on any one figure to control this vast theater. I think partially because of geography, but also because of the the inherent tension between the services too, and administrative disagreements. The Navy doesn't want to serve under MacArthur. The Army doesn't want its ground forces controlled by admirals, and so you can kind of understand both points of view, and you end up with this kind of joint theater arrangement between Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, who becomes Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, and then of course MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area once he leaves the Philippines. So it's so really for the whole war they're kind of wrestling with the vastness of space, both in terms of the organizational structure, but also I think maybe even more meaningfully in terms of the transportation and logistics and lines of communication of this whole thing, which can be so tenuous, especially with not a great deal of developed infrastructure and a lot of our map there.
So, speaking of logistics and infrastructure, we got a question, or I hope. Well, I'm going to read it because I clicked on it and I can't get it up to you.
No, tell me who it is.
It's Wally Morrison's question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who?
It's
Great question. Okay. Yeah. So I see it. Yeah. Thanks, Wally.
But we should read it for the podcast people who are listening.
Okay. Who was it that developed the logistical support for the Army over such long distances?
Yeah, so really this comes down to Army service forces. You may know that during the war, the Army is basically kind of organized into three major blocks. The Army Air Forces, which is the successor to what was called the Army Air Corps before the war. Army Service Forces, then Army Ground Forces, of which all the divisions and whatnot were a part. So Army Service Forces really has primary responsibility for the logistical support of the war, and that means in many cases a lot of port battalions for unloading ships. You also will have under the Army's transportation branch, you'll actually have ships. So the Army has its own Navy, ironically, during World War II, inevitably in MacArthur's theater called MacArthur's Navy. And so they're taking care of a lot of the logistics. The Signal Corps is taking care of the lines of communication, which are very, very difficult to maintain. So transportation, when we talk about that in relation to the war against Japan, it's water transportation and then the traditional ground transportation too. Quartermasters, so that could be anything from the unloading of ships to the moving of supplies to wherever they need to be, to graze registration. I mean, it's and then the other side of it too that I think really gets overlooked: aviation engineers, because in most cases the reason we're assaulting an island to try and take it is we either want to capture an airfield or we want to build an airfield there to further project air power, of course. And so somebody's got to do that. Somebody's got to build those airfields. Somebody's got to develop all that infrastructure. The Army's aviation engineers are doing that globally, but especially in the war against Japan. And this is another instance where another group is better known, the Navy's construction battalions, or Seabees, who are, of course, remarkable. But there are just nowhere near as many of them as there are Army aviation engineers that are doing this job. It's really much more common for them.
Well, let me just pick up on that a second, John. I mean, because obviously nothing like this has been fought before. Does the Army even have these units at the start of the war? Or do they know they're going to need them? Or is this all kind of created on the fly?
Chris, more of it is created on the fly than we would like to admit. Right. So before the war, there are people who are anticipating doctrinally that you're going to need this kind of support in a war against Japan. Right. So you already have aviation engineers. You've got all these different, sort of components within the engineer branch, obviously, of which aviation is just one of them. And kind of the same thing with quartermasters. But I don't think we really have quite the sense of what precisely we're going to need in terms of unit structure and in terms of transportation, all that, until we start invading islands. And, that's really kind of Guadalcanal forward, which, the Army is a big part of that battle too. So a lot of this is on the fly. And then, of course, it goes all the way back to Bray and Somerville in Washington, D.C. He's the head of Army Service Forces, that he's just going to be battling like tooth and nail to try and get manpower, trying to get trained up manpower, trying to get equipage. because really the priority in a way is for the Army Air Forces, and they require a lot of logistical support within their own branch. And then obviously Army Ground Forces too. So it's a bit of an international struggle between Hap Arnold, Brian Somerville, and of course Leslie McNair controlling Army Ground Forces.
All right. Okay.
So, okay, there's a general who you've mentioned a couple of times here, and I want to touch on him.
Yeah. Okay,
I don't want it to take up the rest of the show. Okay. But I think it's fair to say that you're not a fan of Douglas MacArthur, at least not in this book. So can you talk a little bit about your point of view on MacArthur, and as part of that, kind of what he gets wrong in the first command that he's got, which is the Philippines in the Pacific.
Oh,
Yeah.
Can I? I want
go ahead,
to
Chris.
piggyback on it. So when you talk, just keep talking, and then explain to me, please, why we put up with it for so long. Okay, go ahead.
Excellent question, Chris. Exactly. So,
So Chris, you and I can go, and I think John will just we'll
next
give him
45
20 minutes
I
or
will
so, and should be good.
MacArthur. Oh gosh, he just brings out so many incredible issues. So,
You can't talk about Patton, and I don't think we can in this show, though we did just mention.
Well, no, you could say
We
he
should-
reminds me of Patton. Okay, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so in the trilogy, this book, Fire and Fortitude, MacArthur takes more lumps than in the other two books because he really has a rough time for the beginning of the war. Now, you're right, Rick. I mean, so many aspects of him I think are incredibly troubling. He's very political. He will basically run for president while in uniform, using members of his staff to liaison with Senator Vandenberg from Michigan, who's basically running his Sub Rosa campaign back in D.C. I mean, it's, I think, an incredibly troubling precedent. He builds a massive cult of personality around him, by cultivating media, stories of the time. And he doesn't really manage the Philippines campaign particularly well. So MacArthur's a dichotomy in that there's never any issue with his personal valor, his personal courage, and he does have a kind of honor about him in a way, in the sense of way he treats people cordially and well in face-to-face encounters, but he also is quite Byzantine in his scheming, behind the scenes. So in the Philippines in particular, what I really take him to task for is just junking, I guess, what I'll just generally call War Plan Orange, which was the idea that the Japanese are probably going to get the drop on us in the Philippines because obviously Japan is just closer, and of course they're better prepared for war once it begins, which is one of the reasons why it happens, why they attack. So MacArthur thinks he's going to be able to defend Luzon, the whole coast, and just, basically push the Japanese into the water. This is an incredible misunderstanding of the situation. And of course, instead, the Japanese get ashore quite easily, actually. And the consequences of this is that the logistical nodes are spread out all over the island rather than concentrated in Bataan, which had been the original War Plan Orange. We hang out in Manila, we hang out at Bataan, we basically hunker down against these guys, and then the Navy will reinforce us, eventually going forward. But and that means that by the time his army retreats at Bataan in early 1942, they're in a terrible logistical state that's getting worse. And so you see that. You see him basically abrogate an order by the War Department in May 1941 for the evacuation of dependents, military dependents. And that means that his wife and his young son are with him during this whole campaign. I really think that's been kind of overlooked by historians in terms of a factor, the factors affecting him, affecting Washington policymakers, wondering what will happen if his family is captured, especially if he builds up this big cult of personality. So it's just such a miscalculation on many levels. He gets, of course, famously most of his air assets destroyed, largely on the ground within a couple of days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he knew all about the attack on Pearl Harbor after it happened and had adequate time to prepare. So these are not his finest moments, so what you're seeing him, I think, in some ways at his worst, his Byzantine, conniving, self-promoting worst at this point in the war, and he's losing, so he doesn't come off particularly well at that stage.
So kind of picking up on this a little bit, John, and obviously people are going to read a lot more in the book, but Could you tell us a little bit about that Philippine campaign? Because I know, and again, in most histories of the war, the Japanese land, there's a short fight, and then they surrender, and then there's a death march, and then we move on to the rest of the war from there. But the Army's fighting a pretty nasty campaign there, and I was just out in the Pacific, and you look at how long the Army lasts in the Philippines, and it's a good deal longer than some of the other countries that encounter the Japanese. So talk a little bit about, once Doug is gone, about their performance there and some of that campaign.
Yeah, actually, the Army's performance, all things considered, is pretty good, really. I mean, they, as you pointed out, Chris, I mean, the Phil-American forces hold out longer in the Pacific than pretty much anybody else did at that stage of the war. And so this is an army that is not really defeated tactically on the field. It's defeated logistically, especially by the time we're in Bataan. The Japanese are outnumbered by a factor of 2 to 1, though MacArthur will try and make it seem otherwise, which is just an out-and-out lie. The Japanese are amateurish in terms of their own logistics. A lot of their guys are going hungry. They're racked by disease. Their medical structure isn't good. They are not resupplying well, and they're really getting defeated at times on the battlefield. Examples I'd give you is they try out flanking amphibious invasions on Bataan in 1942, and they are crushed. I mean, these perimeters are snuffed out. The Japanese are defeated, and so, as this unfolds, I really go into this in depth in this book, that first Philippines campaign, because you're right. I really do think that a lot of it is breezed over, and I think that's unfortunate, because I think on some levels the Americans and Filipinos are acquitting themselves quite well, but they're also doomed because of the logistical situation. They just are not going to get resupplied. So most of our guys, as we get into February, March, April, are spending the bulk of their time looking for food, and they're on quarter and half rations. And so when a Japanese attack comes, maybe 2 or 3 out of 10 of us are in a position where we have the strength to hold them off. So, and it's one of the reasons why the Bataan Death March is as bad as it is, because the Japanese hadn't understood just how terribly physically diminished the Americans and Filipinos were. It's about a 60, 70-mile march that soldiers in good condition, well-fed, could probably do okay. But most of these guys are terribly underweight. Many of them have beriberi, other tropical diseases, and so they're quite vulnerable. And, of course, the Japanese only add to that situation through their own cruelty and neglect. So it's an enormous and incredibly troubling human story. And I really tried to get deep into this. From the POW point of view, and certainly from the tactical point of view, what the fighting was, and also Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who I would argue really emerges as the best combat and field commander on the Phil-American side. He really does a lot of what MacArthur takes credit for at some levels. Yeah. Wainwright performs pretty darn well.
There's a bunch of different directions we can go from.
Let's keep bashing MacArthur. This is fun.
But I think bringing that up periodically it's a good plan, and maybe at some point we can also contrast him with Robert Eichelberger, who is probably one of your favorite generals in the Pacific, at least in this early day. But one of the things that struck me, and you kind of alluded to it, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about it, is that neither army is really ready to go to war in the South Pacific. And I mean, I always thought of, my knowledge of the Pacific is pretty limited. So I always thought that the Japanese they were dug in, they're well trained, they're organized, they've got everything going for them. But they're thrashing around as well, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially the Imperial Japanese Army, which is really not prepared for amphibious warfare, for warfare in the Pacific, and almost by design, in the sense that we all know the dramatic tensions between the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Army. Boiling it down, I would say that the Imperial Army views the war in China as their war and what they wanted, that continental Asian kind of empire and presence. And they view, once Japan decides to go to war with the U.S. and the other Western powers, they view that as the Navy's war. Out there, that the Navy has to take care of, and the Navy has its own ground forces, the Special Naval Landing Forces that are often miscalled Marines. They're not Marines in an American sense with a separate service or whatever. They're basically members of the Navy who are oriented toward ground fighting. And so you have that, and then you got the Imperial Army kind of halfwaying it, with whatever they can spare. And they don't have enough shipping, and they don't have the landing craft for good amphibious operations. So they just happen to run up against an even worse prepared enemy, particularly the colonial powers, the Dutch, the British, and also the U.S. to some extent too. But all of this, we're seeing maybe the seeds of their destruction later on in their kind of amateurishness in the Philippines and in portions of the South Pacific. That later on, once the Allies develop better aerial transport, better landing craft, all that, you're going to really see them go well beyond the Japanese. So it's not until we're fairly well into 1944 that the Imperial Army is even going to get all that serious about fighting the Americans on some levels. And I know that's hard to wrap our mind around, but that's kind of the reality institutionally for them. So the war is already this bad. Imagine if the Imperial Army had been more committed to it. But it also gives you a little window on the fact that China is central to the whole thing. That's why the Roosevelt administration prioritized keeping China in the war, as we call it. Why China is the epicenter in some ways of the entire conflict with Japan.
Well, okay, Chris, can I jump in with a follow-up, or did you want to go?
But of course, no.
Well, I was just going to say, you do make the point in the book that China is the heart of the war in the Pacific, and I think that to most Americans that sounds a bit off, because not necessarily we doesn't necessarily include Chris, but we would think of that we're fighting the Japanese in Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea, and China's sort of way off there on the side. But you say it's central to the very fact that the war is going on. So explain that.
Yeah, I mean it's what started the war in the first place. The conflict between the U.S. and Japan was the balance of power in China and on the Asian continent, and the Japan wanting to basically create a new order in that respect, a Japanese-dominated order, and the United States wanting the old kind of colonial open door and sponsoring, obviously, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist party and government. So this is where the whole conflict begins, and then once it does begin, we are heavily invested in China remaining in the war because we understand it's tying down the better part of the Imperial Army. By the end of the war, I mean, even by then, you're talking about, I'm generalizing, but roughly about half of the Imperial Army ground forces are deployed in China. And of course, even at that end point in the war, in 1944, they launched their biggest ever offensive in the history of Japan itself, Ichigo, a massive ground offensive in China. And so that's happening even as concurrently we have all these major island battles too, involving obviously U.S. forces. So China, loses something on the order of about 15 million people in the war. We'll never know precisely how many, but it's a lot. And so really, I mean, China is the central part of this whole story. And then if we're looking beyond that, what happens in China, the profound tragedy of the outcome of the Civil War with the People's Republic of China being established and all the tension that led to during the Cold War and does ever since, I think when we look back at it that way, we see, oh my gosh, this was this was incredibly important, and yet, under the tension of a global war where we've got all these responsibilities all over the planet, and the Europe First strategy and all that, which I'm not necessarily arguing against. I am saying though that one byproduct of it was less emphasis on China and thus perhaps less influence and not maybe the outcome that we would have wanted. It stands to reason. So again, all of this, the Army is intimately involved with all this and kind of has to deal with all these problems that stem from China outward.
So John, I mean, for fear of bringing down a lightning bolt in our collective heads at the moment, make a case for me for the MacArthur's Drive, because I'm a big Central Pacific guy in that regard, and I think a lot of other people are. So, is it necessary?
You mean the drive to the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So MacArthur, of course, would argue that any room MacArthur's in has to be the most important room.
Well, obviously, but he'd be wrong, of course.
But he could be 100% wrong, couldn't he? But if I'm arguing for him, I think there's one thing that he does have insight on in the long term with us that resonates today. I think he understood that America's future to some extent was in Asia, and a lot of our interests going forward going to be in Asia. And I think there's some truth to that even to this day. And so to him, he would say it's about more than just bringing Japan to its knees. It's about having the presence in Asia and how we bring that about. Now, of course, for him, it's all about, too, the redemption once American forces are defeated in the Philippines, coming back and liberating the Philippines. He argues that has really major consequences going forward with our credibility with allies. And he would say, when we control the Philippines archipelago, we sever Japan's sea lanes from the home islands to what is today Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies back then. That is going to really bring Japan to its knees. Now, I'd also say, too, that on some level you could say he's just protecting Nimitz's flank over in the island hopping campaign. It's going, in that straighter line towards Japan itself. But at the same time, that's a pretty vulnerable flank behind that island hopping campaign. And so it comes down to whether we're going to invade in the Philippines or what was called Formosa, today Taiwan. And the Navy tended to want the latter, and obviously the Army and MacArthur wanting the Philippines and getting what they wanted. So for MacArthur, really the broad obsession for this war, the beginning, the midpoint, and the end, is all about the Philippines. And so he would argue that it has that larger kind of impact on defeating Japan by severing its sea lanes.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting with John McManus, who is the author of Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1943. And I did note, John, that some of the promotional material for that first book say it's going to be a 2-volume series, but
he's having so much fun.
It expanded into a 3-volume series. But your book includes the many perspectives of Japanese soldiers, largely taken from diaries, many of which clearly belong to soldiers who died later in the war. Let me read you one quote from one, just to give an example. This is from a Japanese soldier after his squad killed an American. "We searched through the dead soldier's belongings and found a Bible, a diary, and a photo of his mother. His mother is a woman with a very kind face. How grieved she would be if she were to hear that her son was killed. Nevertheless, this is fate. For many years he has been our enemy, but now that he has become a departed soul, we forgave him for the resentment we held and buried him." And I think these diary entries kind of give you a very different view of Japanese soldiers. So how did you find them, and why was it important to you to include them?
So I'll start with the second and follow up with the first. It was incredibly important for me to include the Japanese perspective, to humanize them on some level. I think maybe in our collective memory all these years later, there's a tendency to almost dehumanize them as fanatics and kamikazes and all this kind of stuff, like they're not like us, quote unquote. Actually, they're very similar to the Americans on a lot of levels. They're young men who have their lives in front of them, who want to live those lives and love their families, and are just soldiers like we are, and so I wanted to bring that to life, to show you these were just everyday guys on some levels. But it also, by the way, doesn't excuse whatever atrocities they may have perpetrated in the Philippines or elsewhere, and I certainly shine a light on that in this book and in the others. And again, I think that deals with this more honestly than the dehumanization, is saying, okay, this is what human beings are capable of, even when they're reasonably decent people, everyday people coming from a pretty highly developed country. So where they came from, this is so interesting, because the Japanese were not signatories to the 1929 Geneva Convention for the disposition of POWs. And so, as such, they envisioned no scenario in which their own people would become POWs and would even lose, of course, on the battlefield. So they had no regulations. Unlike the Americans, they had no regulations against the keeping of diaries. We didn't want our guys keeping diaries because we were worried they could fall into the hands of the enemy, especially if you were captured. And so what ends up happening is that Allied soldiers, primarily U.S. and Australian soldiers, are recovering these diaries on the bodies of Japanese military personnel throughout the entire war, especially at this point now in the South Pacific on New Guinea. And then you have MacArthur's headquarters had what was called the Allied Translator and Interpreter section that is basically, in many cases, using Japanese Americans to translate these diaries into English so that it can be used for intel purposes at the time. Now, of course, for me as an historian coming along decades later, it's more of a human dimension and a primary source to use to get a sense too. So there's enormous amounts of this material, much of it quite mundane, but a lot of it incredibly poignant, where I could point to, like, okay, this guy was fighting in this battle that I'm talking about, and this is what happens to him, and this is the last stages where he's talking in his diary about how he knows he's going to die, and he misses his family, and he's basically starving to death or about to get killed by American firepower or whatever. And so I wanted to kind of present both sides that way, because as you guys know, I mean, what really interests me is the human dimension of war and the average soldier's experience. And in this case, we have a wonderful tool that gives us the insight into the Japanese too.
And is that stuff just at the National Archives? I mean, is it some other people who are interested could go find it there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a vast corpus at the National Archives in College Park, and so it just kind of depends what interests you. What interests me the most generally is the human experience and placing them on various battlefields and getting a sense of that. You could get a sense of Japanese doctrine too, because they captured that kind of material as well. Japanese maps. I mean, you name it. There's a whole mishmash of material within that collection, and it's enormous. It's a hard collection to negotiate. You have to be patient with it, because for every let's say we're just talking about boxes here. For every archival, say 5 archival box you're looking at, there's probably only 1 or 2 of them that are going to give you much of what you would want to see, and the rest of it could be pretty mundane. But so you just stick with it, and there's a lot of really neat stuff in there.
So, John, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about kind of comparing and contrasting with the Army and the Marine Corps, because of course one of the things that I get on a lot of my trips, and I'm sure you've run into, is the idea that the Marines handle all the landings and the Army kind of comes in afterwards and helps pick up the mess. But obviously the Army does have a way of doing what it does in the Pacific. So is there kind of a specific Army doctrine that's developed? Are they working in tandem with the Marine Corps? Are they copying the Marine Corps? Or I'd be curious to know too, is the Marine Corps learning anything from the Army during all of this?
They're both learning from each other, and they're both working together very, very commonly and usually very, very well. So that is one of the great myths of the Pacific War, that the Marines do the initial landing, the Army just kind of mops up after. Actually, the Marines carried out 15 amphibious invasions in the course of this war. Rick mentioned Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger earlier. You know, he ends up as an Army commander by the end of the war. His 8th Army alone carried out 35 in the Philippines in the spring of 1945. The Army in the course of the war carried out 100 plus amphibious invasions. So the vast majority of invasions were actually exclusively Army, especially in the Philippines, where we do the bulk of our fighting. More commonly, if we're talking about Marines and Army working together, they either invade together, as they do like in the Battle of Okinawa, maybe it would be an example toward the end of the war, or you have, yes, sometimes the Marines going in first, like at Guadalcanal, and then being augmented by the Army and usually supplanted by the Army. And so there are very, very, very few exclusively Marine Corps battles really in the history of the Corps. But in this war, you're talking about maybe Tarawa, Cape Gloucester, and sort of Iwo Jima, but the Army had an entire infantry regiment that fought there as well. So, and yes, Chris, they did learn a lot from each other. They, I think, by and large, the average soldier and Marine respected each other deeply in combat, in real combat, and they fought very similarly. So there's this idea of the Marines with the, quick frontal attacks and frontal assaults to take islands, and of course, there's some, like a lot of myths, there's some degree of truth. Because, of course, they come from the naval side of the house, and the Navy doesn't want its ships hanging around near any place we've invaded because they could be vulnerable the longer they're there. That's 100% true, whereas, of course, the Army is more tuned toward continental littoral operations where you don't worry about that. And, you have more deliberate advance using all your combined arms and all your logistics. But with that said, actually, when you look at how they really fought, no matter what battle we're talking about here, Saipan, Okinawa, Guadalcanal, whatever. They tend to fight very similarly. Marines aren't stupid. They're not going to go straight into enemy firepower just for the heck of it. The Army isn't cowardly and just going to hunker down and say, well, let's wait for the artillery to take care of everything. No, they do combined arms, and they fight very, very well. The problems tend to ensue, in my opinion, when you have command issues. When you've got, in the case of like a guy like Holland Smith, one of the Marine generals who just hates every other service, the Army included, creates tension. Or when you have Army commanders who don't respect the Marines at a senior officer level, as will happen to some extent with Lieutenant General Robert Richardson, who is the highest ranking Army officer in Nimitz's command. That's where the trouble is, not necessarily the average Marine or soldier. And I think sometimes that gets lost in our memory of this.
Well, we've gone through most of the hour, 2/3 of it, and we haven't gotten into too many of the battles, and maybe we should at least look at a few of them. One of the places, after the Philippines, really one of the places where kind of MacArthur's drive and the Army drive north starts is in New Guinea, and particularly in a place called Buna. And I mean, I can remember reading about Buna in the Manchester's biography of MacArthur's. First time I'd ever heard of it, and I suspect a lot of other people are. Buna's not quite up there with Bastogne and places like that. But tell us about what's going on there. The 32nd Division is involved, although other divisions get involved as well. What's happening with Buna? Why is it important? What are we learning? Yeah, and do it all in a couple of minutes.
Sure, no problem. Yeah. So I guess the starting point for this is, of course, Buna is in Papua New Guinea, like the southeastern part of New Guinea, and that's really like the first place where MacArthur is going to try and reverse the tide and begin his own offensive back eventually across New Guinea with the intention of getting the Philippines. Okay, so what I think is really, really important to understand is that Buna and the fighting that takes place there, as you see on this map, on these various spots along that north coast especially, Buna is actually the same campaign as Guadalcanal that is happening concurrently with this in the latter parts of 1942. And we tend to not look at it that way as Americans because it's under two different commands, because William Halsey under Nimitz controls Guadalcanal, and it starts out as a Marine battle and eventually ends up as an Army and Marine battle. And then obviously MacArthur's thing, which is him and the Australians, the U.S. Army and the Australians doing their thing in New Guinea. Well, from a Japanese perspective, they are absolutely two battles of the same campaign, and that's why the Japanese lose, because they're spread out too thin in both places and are eventually overwhelmed. So at Buna, what's at issue there is that the Japanese have tried to take Port Moresby on New Guinea's southeastern coast, and the significance of that, of course, is that might allow them to invade the northern part of Australia. Now, they had famously tried to do this in the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. They had failed. They try overland deeper, into the midsection of 1942. They fail. So the Australians and the Americans are launching a counteroffensive of their own in what I'll call the fall of 1942. But remember, this is the southern hemisphere, so reverse it. It's actually the spring. And that entails going and taking those Japanese fortified enclaves there on the north coast, most notably Buna. So the Army's 32nd Infantry Division is going to carry the load in doing this. And I mentioned airlift capacity earlier. That's largely how we're going to be able to deploy these guys. Not an amphibious invasion. Initially, they're going to try and move a battalion over land, and it's just a nightmare. It's the worst terrain on the planet, practically. And so the airlift capacity allows us basically to besiege Buna and the other enclaves they've got there. And Buna ends up actually as the first American ground victor in World War II. It's over by January 3rd, I think it is, 1943. And the mastermind behind it all is the guy who's going to basically put out a lot of fires for MacArthur in the course of this war, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who you see right here, standing right there in the foreground. Eichelberger basically takes over this fight as basically a 3-star and a corps commander, controlling kind of a reinforced division and leading like a squad leader for the most part, most every day. Over the course of about a month of fighting in December 1942, he loses 30 pounds. The problem you run into tactically at Buna is most of the ground is flooded or marshy, swampy. And there's only certain route or avenues of advance. which they have basically turned into kill zone with coconut log reinforced bunkers. And so any movement can lead to just getting into a maze of a kill zone. So Eichelberger has to kind of crack these tactical nuts one by one after the other. And the only way to make it happen sometimes is to lead himself, believe it or not, as a general, fighting like a sergeant. And so this is a kind of epic battle that happens here. The 32nd Division fights almost nearly to its own extinction. The Japanese forces there fight certainly to theirs, and that's the precedent is set for that, mostly for the rest of this war too. Boone is terrifically important, so I wish it was known better. I don't know whether my book has had impact in that regard, but I at least wanted to cover it as thoroughly as possible.
Oh, by the way, we haven't bashed MacArthur in at least 10 minutes, so if you could work something about that into your next answer. Yeah.
There he is.
Hey. So keeping it strictly to the first volume, because I know we've been kind of all over the place and we have 2 more volumes to go, but this early period of the war, one of the things that, when you're looking at Europe, you hear talk about the Americans and their allies and allied forces and a much kind of a broader scope of combatants. Obviously, there are allies in the Pacific, but you don't really hear as much about that. So I'd like to know why you think that might be, and how is the Army working with allied forces during, your first volume?
I mean, the biggest way there's several places, but Philippines. I mean, in the first place, I think that's where we start with all this. I mean, and Philippine forces really get worse treatment in that first campaign than do the Americans. Like, so something in the order of about 400 to 600 Americans die on the death march, probably about 10,000 Filipinos. So that's kind of something of a harbinger for what's to come. We're also obviously working with the Chinese, and that's a very much star-crossed alliance there. But in the South Pacific, our main partners are the Australians. And the Australians are really carrying the load of the war for the Allies in 1942 and 43. And I think that tends to get overlooked as well. They're at full mobilization. They've just had a terrible situation where the bulk of their ground combat forces on the other side of the world, even as this war has started in their own background, in their own neighborhood, So so the Australians are working closely with the U.S. Army at that point. And initially, MacArthur allows a really toxic kind of environment in his command of his officers denigrating the Australians, and even he doing the same thing. And it's really quite unconscionable, in my opinion. And so that's one of the things that was happening at Buna is
Thank you for the negative words about MacArthur there. We do appreciate it.
Exactly. So we've got to bash him, and here's where it's appropriate. I mean, it was unconscionable. It really was. And so and it's one of the reasons why things had bogged down at Buna, is that the Americans and Australians were not working well together. And this begins to change once Eichelberger's in place, to be honest with you, because he will forge really good, productive relationships with his Australian colleagues, General Herring in particular. And then MacArthur will kind of get the message on that, because again, we've been bashing him, but he also learns, and he will eventually become much more positive in his relations with the Australians, particularly Prime Minister Curtin, even as he starts to forge very productive relationships with his naval and Army Air Forces colleagues going forward. So MacArthur's learning too, but at this point, his command is just not where it needs to be in terms of the coordination. And the other thing about the Australians, remember, they're hosting the Americans on a large scale. About 1 million Americans either passed through Australia or are based there during World War II. And that's like second only to Britain. And so I have a major chapter in this book about that, which is, I think
Mutton.
About the mutton. Exactly. Eating mutton. And of course, I know this will shock you guys. They're complaining about it. The Americans are complaining about the food and about the beer and the food. And it's not like this and not like home. And, so the Australians constantly are having to tolerate that. In addition, of course, to our racial tension and race problems, which are, more or less imported by the U.S. there. Although you had the white Australia policy too, which initially Australia was not going to accept our African-American soldiers, many of whom were coming as aviation engineers to build airfields and whatnot. The U.S. government insists that we do so. MacArthur, to his credit, insists that they will do so. And then once they're on the ground, their worst treatment tends to be not from the Australian population, but from their fellow countrymen who want to enforce Jim Crow. So it's a really complex story in that regard too. We also, by the way, import a serial killer who will kill several Australian women before the military authorities and the Australian authorities apprehend this guy. His name is Edward Leonsky. It's the creepiest thing, but it absolutely had happened, and it's again, I went into some pretty good depth in that without getting too deep into the rabbit hole. But I just thought, wow,
It's a substantial book, folks.
It is. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts.
Well, it is. It's really complicated, right? I mean, and you're constantly, any part of it that you go into, you suddenly realize there's all this detail, there's all the logistics, there's the food, and how are we going to please the soldiers? How are we going to keep the civilian population surviving at the same time that we're trying to keep the American soldiers doing what they're doing? And all of this just has to happen so quickly.
Yeah. I mean, the mobilization has to be so quick by necessity because we're worried about Australia's security and whether there could be a Japanese invasion. And we know now, in retrospect, this was unlikely given Japanese capabilities, but they don't really quite know that at the time. And this is a really seminal moment in Australia's history. And I think you really see an alliance forged that remains strong today, 80 some odd years later. And so when you look at like especially on New Guinea, when the average GI and the average Australian soldier come into contact, there's a very strong camaraderie. Buna, Gona, Sanananda, all these really quite horrible places for these guys to fight. I think there's a very good working partnership that is forged by 1943.
All right, so we're gonna come out of left field here. Another forgotten campaign. We want you to weigh in on here because I think it kind of gets sidelined as the Aleutians. And 3 minutes or less. What?
Well, yeah, I mean, and just to show it how far away that is, New Guinea's down there by Australia, and then way, way up north at the Attu and Kiska.
Absolutely, great point, Chris. I mean, yeah. So this is the Army's only cold weather campaign, really the only American cold weather campaign in the war against Japan. It happens in May 1943. What, of course, many people probably know that the Japanese had seized those islands in hopes of establishing an air base on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, from which to hit Canadian and maybe Pacific Northwest targets. This was a kind of one of the moving parts of the campaign that had led to the Battle of Midway the year before. And so the American authorities, the War Department feels that honor dictates that we must retake our soil. And so the 7th Infantry Division, the Army 7th Infantry Division, the Hourglass Division, which still exists, it's given the job of going into Attu. And so their casualties in that battle in May of 43 are almost equal to the Japanese casualties, though, of course, the Japanese almost all die. It's 5,000 plus of them snuffed out. And the bulk of our casualties are like trench foot, freezing casualties, combat fatigue, but it is really a horrifying battle. That again, like in the rest of the book, I go into it in a great deal of depth. The division commander, Major General Burfee Brown, is relieved by superiors who are not even on site, who don't really know what's going on, and it's a shame for his career, though. In the larger scheme, what really matters is what's happening for these poor guys fighting on the ground. He will exonerate himself later, but it just shows just how in crisis we are at this point. Even in a victory, we're defeating the Japanese at Attu, and yet the 7th Division suffers a heck of a bloody nose there, and all of this such in crisis, in part because of the weather. The weather's so difficult.
You've got a lot of stories of individual soldiers as well in the book. Is there any one that stands out for you that you kind of go back to that and remember that story because it's just so incredible?
Well, Eichelberger, in a way, from a command level, of course, and we're going to see him through the whole series. And I think, in my opinion, he's the finest American ground commander of the war against Japan, and probably in all of World War II that most of us have never heard of. But in terms of just an individual, maybe at a lower level, he's a major and then promoted to Lieutenant Colonel Harold K. Johnson. Johnson, had been with the Philippine Division in fighting on Bataan. He was serving as like a staff officer, then a battalion commander. He was a West Pointer, class of 1933, and he ends up getting captured. He is a survivor of the Bataan Death March, and he is incarcerated, of course, for the rest of the war. And so we see his experience certainly in the campaign in Fire and Fortitude, but also the POW experience. And he's a remarkable person on so many levels. As this situation gets worse and worse for the POWs, starvation, neglect, disease, he becomes more ethical. He becomes more caring, more spiritual, more caring about his fellow soldiers. I mean, he's a true leader. And I don't think that happens all that often. Most of us, it's kind of dog eat dog, and the Japanese kind of wanted it to be that way. So you see, it's established one of the most remarkable military careers of the 20th century because, later on in life, he'll be Army Chief of Staff, but he's very fortunate to survive the war. As maybe we'll discuss when we talk about the later volumes. I mean, he gets down to about 100 pounds, and there's many times during this war where he almost dies. So when I think of an individual who kind of embodies that, maybe the Army spirit, if we're looking at the best of the Army at this point, I think Harold Johnson certainly shapes up to that image.
So John, go ahead.
No, you finish it off, Chris.
No, I was going to say, so, we kind of started way back when at Pearl Harbor, and why don't you tell us where the Army's at the end of this volume? Tell us why you decided to end it where you did, and kind of set us up for Part 2.
Yeah, so I end the volume in the fall of 1943, and I can say that because now we've moved north of the equator, in the invasion of Macon, which of course happens in tandem with the more famous invasion of Tarawa. And so by the end of 1943, we see an Army that is absolutely just completely grown in that year and a half period since Pearl Harbor into a pretty professional military force. And so obviously it's a citizen army on many levels, but it's being run, I think, increasingly well, in part because of the logistics that we've seen, but it's dealing with all these different missions, it's dealing with all these different challenges, and then you can just kind of see it growing and maturing by the end of 43, kind of like the U.S. itself. And so the Army by the end of 1943 is becoming a really potent adversary for the Japanese. The 27th Division, of course, takes Macon in about 4 days, roughly 4 or 5 days, even as the more ferocious fighting is happening at Tarawa. And so we see then this kind of harbinger that Nimitz's campaigns are going to include a lot of Army forces going forward in his island hopping campaign. And we also see where MacArthur is by that point, steadily moving his way across New Guinea, and then everything that means in between for the logistics and the human side of the story. It's really very humbling, honestly, to see where it all is at that point. From a Japanese point of view, it's pretty discomforting because this your adversary is growing stronger and is becoming capable of much more complexity in their operations: amphibious, logistics, transportation, nodes of communication, aviation. I mean, and all of that is starting to add up, where you're seeing a kind of a maturity there.
Yeah.
Well, John McManus, thank you so much for joining us today to chat about.
So we'll have him back then for.
Well, I think can we get a vote? we still have 88 people here. Thumbs up if you want John to come back, and John, you can vote as many times as you like. Of course, we'll have him back.
Really
and when he comes back, we'll have him talk about this guy.
MacArthur.
Yes.
That's important. But John's book, first volume in his series, which I know some of you have read, is called Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1943. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm glad we got around to it eventually.
Me too.
Okay. And Chris, so next week, where will you be?
I think I'll be in Berlin then.
Berlin.
Yes.
I'll take Berlin. Okay.
Yes.
Next week, we will not be dealing with World War II. I will be in Philadelphia. We will not be dealing with Philadelphia either.
Thank God for that.
We're going to go to the Old West.
Yes.
And a new book about female outlaw Belle Starr. The book is called Queen of All Mayhem, The Blood-Soaked Life and Mysterious Death of Belle Starr, the Most Dangerous Woman in the West. They're definitely trying to tell you a lot of the story in the subtitle. Is there anything left after that? But the author of that book is...
And great cook.
Is Dane Hucklebridge, and we'll be talking to Dane about her dangerous life and mysterious death. Belle Starr, yeah. I mean, I remember her picture from all the books on the Old West. Know almost nothing about her aside from that. So, looking forward to finding out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Guys, please, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, and back us on Patreon. Oh, and do browse historyhappyhour.com, where you can find all of our old shows.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
No, come on, Rick.